So the box I'm creating is inspired by the box made, the Sashimono box made by HT Morris Furniture on YouTube. So first I start out by squaring out the square stock. So I'm using my low angle jack plane to make sure that all sides are square and remove the saw marks that are there from the sawmill. So this is essential to have square stock while doing joinery, so that it's much easier for you to get better layout lines, and so the joint fits much better. Make sure you have a sharp blade so that you don't get any tear out, and I'm gonna keep checking it with the square to make sure that the sides are square. So the mortises will be in this square stock. So this is a 1/4 inch mortise that I'm cutting, and this and the tenons will be there in the sides of the box like the panels. So that once the tenons are cut, they go into the mortise and they form like a box shape. So I'm using a normal bench chisel. You don't need any fancy mortise chisel. I mean, a bench chisel worked fine. I used a 1/4 inch Narex chisel. You can use any other chisel, a 1/4 inch chisel in this case. So I clear out waste with a smaller 1/8 inch chisel so that I can chop down further. I've put some tape on my chisel so that I know if I so that I know I've reached the depth. In this case, it's 1/2 inch. So I've learned a lot about chopping mortises from the video by Rob Cosman, which I'll link to below. You should definitely watch it to understand a to get a better understanding of chopping mortises. He explains it really well and in great detail, so you should definitely watch that. There's a 1/8 inch wall on one side here where the tenons are, and then there will be a 1/8 inch shoulder on the piece that will be facing inside of the box. So it will be completely flush from the inside. Since this is old Burmese teak, it's a pretty hardwood, so I was not too worried about the 1/8 inch wall. Obviously, I was very careful with the 1/8 inch wall, but I wasn't too worried if it would snap in the joint. And since this is a box, it's completely fine. We're going to use the Ryoba saw to just chop it free, like chop the individual pieces free. So I'm going pretty slowly to make sure that I don't cut into the piece, so that I cut very square to the pieces. Now I'm gonna pair the insides of the mortise to the proper dimensions, which is like a 1/4 inch by 3/4 inch for this side. I make sure you have a super sharp chisel so that it cuts cleanly. And now these pieces will be cut to 4 inches. So then after cut them slightly more than 4 inches on the saw, and then on the shooting board trim them to perfectly 4 inches. Now I am quite excited to work on the sides of the box. This is some quarter sawn old Burmese teak, which is really fun to work with. So for the sides of the box, I needed roughly 28 inches. This is with a little spare, like including like the cuts of the saw, so that I don't have like the thickness of the saw plate or the saw curve removed from the panels. So I will mark out 28 inches from here. I'm following the golden ratio so that I get so that the box sides are aesthetically appealing, so that they look kind of in a good ratio. I'll just use my Ryoba saw to cross cut the piece to 28 inches, so then I can work on the piece like individual sides, like cut it from this. I will now use my low angle jack plane to joint the edges so that they are square to the faces of the board, and I'm gonna trim these to about 3 7/8 of an inch. So there's about a 1/8 inch gap between the floor, like where the box will be placed, and the panels, so that the feet, like the pillars, can act like small feet. If you don't have a jointer plane, you can use this low angle jack plane or any bench plane. You can also use a number 4. I mean, that is a little smaller in length, so it might not give that straight of an edge, but this that would work completely fine. You just check it with a straight edge. But this low angle jack plane is so fun to work with. When I hone up the blade and make it really sharp, it gives me some really nice curls on the wood, and it's an absolute pleasure to work with. I am now marking out the layout for like the side panels, including the tenons. So the stock that I cut the mortises on was 3/4 inch square. So the mortise is that I cut in that so that the mortises don't protrude through and they don't make that stock weak, was about 1/2 inches. So I'm adding 1/2 inch to both sides of the board so that I get the space for the tenon. to get the sizing of my box, I'm going to be following the golden ratio. So this is basically where one side is, so there's a ratio between the sides. So 1 is to 1.618. So basically one side would be 1.618 times more than the other. So this is just a rule of thumb that I follow for, I mean, I just learned this, so I'm going to be applying this to both the boxes. So it was quite interesting, and it looks really, it's supposed to be very visually appealing. So I just said, why not, let's try it out for the boxes. When I put a dry fit, like, it really looked to a good ratio. So you would multiply the shorter side, so that would be 1, and then you would multiply that by 1.618 to get the size of the length for the other longer panels. Now for marking the tenons, I'm gonna be using a marking wheel so that I can get walls. So the tenon has to be a quarter of an inch so that it fits into the quarter-inch mortise, and leave enough space so that the wall on one side of the mortise was about an eighth of an inch, which it doesn't follow the rule of thirds, but since this is a box, it's completely fine, I guess. So so one of the sides was an eighth of an inch, and the other was 3/8 of an inch, like, because there's a quarter-inch mortise. So I was leaving an eighth of an inch wall on when I was marking out the tenons. So now I'll use my so this is a carcass saw to cut the tenon. So I'm just starting it out with this saw because it's a bit tough for me to start it with the rib teeth on the Ryoba saw. This carcass saw has cross-cut teeth, so it was a bit easier to start the cut with that. You can definitely do this with the carcass saw, but it's a little faster with a rib saw. So I just started out with the carcass saw and then cut it properly with a Ryoba saw with the rib teeth. Now to cut the shoulders, so I will use the carcass saw just to cut a little ways away from the line so that I don't mess up that line. And once I cut that waist off, I make sure not to cut into the tenon, but then I will now use a very sharp chisel to pare the tenon so that it's square and it follows that marking gauge line. So this is really satisfying to see, to use a very sharp chisel and pare off that end grain. It's very satisfying, and make sure you don't chip out, so you don't push enough so that it chips from the other side. So be very careful, take this slow. It's a very tedious process but very rewarding once you get a nice fit. Now that the shoulders have been paired and the cheeks of the tenon have been cut, we can start to move on to cutting the tenons that will fit into the mortises. So when you are using the coping saw to remove the waste in between, make sure the show side, like the side that will face outward, is facing you so that you don't cut into the sides of the piece. So I used the carcass saw because I felt I was a bit more precise. I used the coping saw to remove waste in between, and then I just like did a slight undercut in the space that there was like no where the material had been removed with the coping saw, so that it had a perfect fit. Now it's time for the glue up, which is really exciting. So I will put glue on the tenons, put glue inside the mortise. I make sure not to put too much glue, but at the same time not to put too less glue. There should be a little bit of squeeze out so that you know there's enough glue coverage, and clamps definitely do help this, so that you're pushing the joint together and it removes any small error that might have been there. So now I want to lock this joint in pretty tightly and permanently. So I'm gonna drill a quarter-inch hole through the wall of the mortise and into the tenon, and then I made a dowel out of teak. I pounded it through my dowel plate, and I got some nice dowels. I pounded, add some glue in the hole and pound in the dowel so that I can there's a pretty good bond. I just add a slight taper to the end so that it goes in snugly, and it's ready. Once it's dry, I just flush cut off the end, sand it, and we can move on to the next part. So the lid is going to be curved. So I made a few relief cuts, and then I started using my chisels to clear out the waste. Now I'm just paring down to a nice curve. So the handle for the lid is inspired by the torii gates in Japan. So now to make this, there are going to be more mortises. So we have to cut more mortises. So this will have a 1/8 inch mortise. I'm using an 1/8 inch chisel. I drilled a small hole to clear out some waste because it's quite delicate. So just to make this much easier, I'm using a so the mortise is going to be an 1/8 inch here. So I gently cut out the mortise, and then I can move on to the other parts of the handle. there will be two such pieces that have the 1/8 inch mortise, and the dimensions of this would be 3/8 of an inch square. So now this piece follows the proper rule of thirds, that is a rule of thumb for furniture making. Now I'm just ripping the piece to 3/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch squared, and I've already cut the mortise so that it's a bit easier for me, because there's a little extra material. So I'll just rip off. I'll use the rip teeth on the saw to cut the piece to length. To attach the handle to the lid, we're going to use round mortise and tenon joints. So more mortise and tenons. It's quite fun to learn all of this. So I just cut a small shoulder around and use my knife to make it the round shape. Now I'm going to attach the two tenons on the top to attach the curved lid. I'm using some wood glue because this would give the strongest bond, and then there will be a piece that slides through the 1/8 inch mortise that's there, and I'll attach that with CA glue because this won't be facing that much force, as it's there mainly for decorative reasons, and because the piece with the wood glue, that would be actually be the part where it's lifted, so that requires the wood glue because that would create a really good bond. So for the base of the box, my friend James Wright told me that I should use plywood instead of solid wood because plywood doesn't expand and contract like solid wood does. So plywood would be a better fit. So I just use a half-inch piece of plywood. I cut it to length and shoot it so that shoot it on the shooting board so that it fits inside the box. So I had ran an experiment to see how long a double boiled linseed oil would take to polymerize so that I can apply water-based polyurethane. So as many of you know, if you've worked with water-based polyurethane, it doesn't really give like a nice amber hue, or it doesn't really pop the grain as much. It just looks like a plastic coating, but it's quite durable. And linseed oil or double boiled linseed oil or boiled linseed oil, whatever, that pops the grain really nicely, but it's not too protective. So I thought, what if we could use both of them to get a really nice finish? So you could just use oil-based polyurethane, but it's very messy and very smelly, and so I wanted to see how long the oil would take to polymerize, and then I can add the water-based polyurethane for some more durability. So for this aeroplane brand boiled linseed oil, it took I got a good results from 3 to 7 days of it drying. So I'm gonna apply a coat of this oil first, wait 3 to 7 days, and then apply water-based polyurethane. Now that the base of the box has dried, I'm going to use my branding iron to brand the box that I've just created. I was pretty happy with how it turned out, so I was super excited to brand it. I heated on the stove and I added a little spritz of water so that the branding iron like burns the Raaghav WoodWorks, my brand, much more clearly, and I'm pretty satisfied with how it turned out. I will just scuff it up with a 220 grit sanding sponge to remove a little extra whatever charred a bit more, and then I just apply a light coat of double boiled linseed oil just to bring the base out a little more so it looks much nicer and clearer. So after the double boiled linseed oil has polymerized, I'm going to apply some water-based polyurethane to give the box some extra durability. So I waited about 3.5 days for it to polymerize. You might have to wait slightly longer or slightly less. I can't say. So I apply the polyurethane with a rag, and then after that's done, I sand it with a 220 grit sanding sponge, and then I apply another layer, and then I sand it again, and I apply another layer. So that's 3 layers, and then after that I can apply some paste wax just so that with the polyurethane this won't be super glossy. It'll be more like a satin finish, and it makes the box really smooth when you hold it.